Beth, why don't we turn on the PowerPoint and...
Yep, getting it right now. Hold on. Well, if I can get them to cooperate.
So we had a few groups that let us know that they were unable to be here today, but will be watching the recorded session. One of the groups, it's because they have a board meeting tonight. So they're not here because they're all in a board meeting tonight. So, greetings everyone, welcome. Michelle says, having lived and worked in Maryland, I love that law, the law that says to make sure that you all are aware you're being recorded tonight, as we do for all of these workshops. My name is the Reverend David Pyle. I am the Governance Program Manager for the Central East region of the UUA, and I am also the primary contact for our congregations of the Delmarva Peninsula, of the Greater Baltimore Cluster, and of the Central Pennsylvania Cluster. And I have some other roles, but we've talked about those in other workshops. We won't worry about that so much. Greetings and welcome you all tonight. As I've said before, I would love to be able to do introductions of everybody in these workshops, and that would be the rest of our time. So it's good to be with you all, and thank you for hanging out and making it through 3 sessions of the Board Basics workshop, done as an online webinar instead of a day-long in-person training, which is how we've done it in the past. I'm ably assisted, and my wonderful co-leader for these workshops, and the person who came to me at General Assembly and said, David, I think we need to do this as a webinar series, so this is happening because it was her idea, is Beth Casebolt. And Beth, would you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm the Communications Consultant and the Operations Manager for the Central East region. I hold the Program Manager portfolio for social media and communications, and serve the Appalachian Cluster as their primary contact.
So thank you, Beth. And in this one, Beth's going to jump in and out in different sections of the workshop, because this is the one where we've moved. Remember, I said we designed these workshops to go from the really theoretical to the really practical, and this is the workshop where we're at the really practical. One of the complications of the really practical in governance workshops is that the more specific you get, the more likely is the chance that it's not going to directly apply to your congregation, right? Because of the difference in the way all of our congregations are designed, like 1,000 differently designed, systems. It just asks you to hang. We're going to give some good ideas. We're going to do some give some practical thoughts. I've got a couple of good things that you can hopefully take into your toolkit to take from here. And it can't be completely detailed. A wonderful, very practical Board Basics course would be able to go deeply into your own congregation system to help you understand. And we're going to give you some guidance for how you can do that for yourself. So the things we're going to cover today in this 3rd session is some guidance on how to read a congregational budget and profit and loss statement. Now, this is one of the ones where when I do this in an in-person session, I have everybody bring their congregational budget and profit and loss session, and we pair up into dyad teams and discern through them together. We're not doing that tonight. So we're going to give some guidance about how to read these documents, and what's important for you to know, and how to make sure that you get the information that you need. We're going to talk about a request that came in from you all, something that wasn't in the original workshop design, but we've decided to add it because of a request that came from you all, and that is a section on contracting and negotiations that the governing board of a congregation often has to do some different levels of contracting with institutions and also negotiation with different parties. We're going to talk about that a little bit. We're going to talk about process observation. Remember, this is mostly about toolkit, things for you to have in your toolkit, and process observation is one. We're going to go through 2 different systems of process observation. We're going to talk about what a consent agenda is and how you use it. Engage with the idea of what's called board meeting versus board workshop. In other words, the idea that you don't always have to meet under Robert's Rules of Order or under your normal practice of a board meeting. There are other ways to engage with one another. We're going to work on voting process and consensus process, which is something that we moved from last session to this session in order to make sure we had time for some stuff in last session. We'll talk about the meeting technology known as powerful questions. And we'll talk about different types of engagement with stakeholders, namely cottage meetings and town halls, and the difference between them and what each of them is used for. I've got a wonderful board cultural assessment. We'll talk about the need for a congregational board to assess its own culture and what that looks like. And I've got a tool that we're going to email out to you all at the end of this meeting that's a really, really easy way for you all to do this kind of board culture assessment. We'll talk about some different board roles and positions and the difference between open and executive sessions. That's the entirety of our time together. So that's a lot, as all these workshops have been kind of a fire hose. That's why we record them so that and send out the materials afterwards, and why the slides are designed to not only be something for you to see on the screen, but also to be notes that you can use going forward and can refer to again in the future. So with all of that, let's go ahead and get started. But the reminders for this workshop, remember to use the chat box for questions. There's a question called hammer that I don't understand from Carlos, but use the chat box for questions as we go forward. Both Beth and I will be watching that. Tools, hammer, gotcha. Now I understand. It can be. I haven't thought about which of our tools we're giving you all could be a hammer. But we will. The slide deck is designed to have both graphics, but also to be notes as you go forward. When sharing stories or questions, remember that your commitments to confidentiality. We haven't had a lot of time for sharing, but sometimes people type things in the chat box. Just to be aware that this is recorded and this is not confidential space. And the webinar is being recorded, and presenters are available outside of the webinar. Both Beth and I spend a good portion of our time as serving as members of your regional staff in conversation with congregational leaders. I said before that my record is 12 congregational meetings in one day held through teleconferences while sitting in this same spot. It's part of our role to be responsive to you all and to help you have a place where you can go for resources and conversation and sometimes just discernment. So leaving from this workshop going forward, remember you have a congregational primary contact, and I always say go to your primary contact first. It's amazing how much of this is something that they can help you with at any time. But Beth and I are also available going forward. Is that a fair thing to say, Beth?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So the next is that in every single one of these workshops, I talk about the underlying assumptions. And this probably gets a little boring by the third workshop, but I think it's a high commitment for me that we're clear about what are the assumptions that we bring to this work. So I'll do this one quickly because you've all seen it before. The purpose of church is not governance. The purpose of church is the congregation's mission. Governance is best when it helps you to live that mission. I've seen congregations that get too stuck into process that they forget that there is a reason for having the congregation in the community. That culture is stronger than structure, that you can make structural change all you want to, but until people are able and willing to change their functioning in a system, the system doesn't change. You can just redesign your committees on a blackboard, but until people function differently, which is why so much of what we teach in this workshop is based in board functioning, not based in structure. We do some kinds of structural analysis work and help congregations with that, but so much of what we do is really focused on how you function better as a board. That the most effective way to make change in a congregational system is not that bulletin board, not that blackboard with the different structural design of committees, but it really is people, a focus group, very intentionally changing how they function and allowing that change to then begin resonating within the congregation. There's no single right way for a governing board to function is another assumption, and that's kind of the assumption that I think gets me in trouble. It's too strong, but I am really agnostic when it comes to congregational governance style. I am only in, is it working for you and serving your mission? Whereas there are other consultants who really have a system that they think is the right way to do it. That's not who I am. And the one that I get the most pushback for from both within and beyond UUA staff, the idea that I don't really believe in best practices. I believe there are good ideas, but best practices assumes a level of commonality amongst our congregations that is hard to reach. What may work well in one congregation will not work well in another congregation of the same size, just because the culture is different. And best practices make an assumption about culture that is unsustainable. I do believe, however, that there are good ideas that you can try in your congregational system to see if it works in your size, your structure, and your culture. So I'm not saying no good ideas. I'm saying there's no guarantee that it will work in your system. All right. So with that, how to read a congregational budget and balance sheet. So there is no standard. You've heard this is the refrain through all of these workshops. There's no standard way for congregations to have their budgets and their balance sheets designed. I have spent the last 4 years reading congregational budgets as part of doing governance assessments and as part of doing staffing assessments. And every single one of them is differently designed. And in my experience, every congregation thinks that theirs is standard to everybody else. But what the different line items are different, how the structure, how it's formed. Every congregation's budget is designed differently. And each congregation has different programs, operational needs, and systemic designs. The budget design for a congregation that has an integral day school is going to be very different than the budget design for a congregation that doesn't have one. Because that day school is a huge program that rests within that congregational system, and it changes the rest of the budget design. How the congregation's program operations are funded, in other words, what each line item is also different in each congregation, is often based on an arbitrary decision that was made long ago by leaders that may not even be in the system anymore. You know, that if you've ever want to watch a treasurer or a bookkeeper have serious problems, go to them and tell them you want to change what the line items mean.
Chart of accounts.
Right.
Which I'm going to point out the UUA did to the regions 3 years ago. Right.
And we're still living into that, right?
Yes.
So, you know, we had the part of trying to bring 4 regions that all had differently designed budgets, 4 districts that all had differently designed budgets into a common thread. And that took 3 years of crosswalk budgets. So just saying that shifting a congregation's budget design is a major task for congregational lay leadership. It also has implications for how accounts are tracked over time. And so most congregations make the decision to just continue with the budget design that they have pretty much in perpetuity, whether it's serving them or not, and redefining for themselves what line items mean, but adapting their functioning to the budget rather than adapting the budget to their functioning. There are exceptions to this rule. I have seen some brave congregations, especially around making major conceptual changes in budget design. Really, it's often been the switch between what is called a mission budget, from a structural budget to a mission budget, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the core thing here is to realize that there is no way I can put up on the screen a thing that says this is the standard budget design for UU congregations. It really is something you have to learn and explore about your own congregational system. Now, I named what a mission budget is. There are 2 major kinds of budgets that actively exist in UU congregations. The most common one is called a structural budget. And a structural budget really defines the congregation based upon its structure. So an example of it would be you have an RE committee, and the RE committee has a budget. You have a congregational staff, and the congregational staff has a budget section. You know, budget line items for each staff position, a subcategory for the professional expenses for each staff position. So it's based upon your congregation structure. And really, when this is done well, what you see is a budget that reflects the congregation structure. The challenge is when your congregation structure adapts, the budget then has to adapt, at least adding new line items. And, you know, one of the ways I see this is often reflected is when a congregation no longer has a staffing position, but that staffing position lives as ghost line item numbers in that budget in perpetuity. Because it is based in the congregation structure and it's really hard to de-adapt. So when you see $0 line items next to a congregational staffing position, it's because that position existed at one time and no longer does now. Sometimes you can go in and have people go in and actually delete that section out, but still reserve those numbers. So you never, in order for most accounting systems, you can never reuse those numbers and still get comparable data. But the difference between a mission budget, a structural budget is based upon the congregation structure. A mission budget really defines budgeting in a completely different way, but through different ministry or program areas. So in other words, you would have, and I'm not going to do a whole class in mission budgeting because that takes about 6 hours, and I'm not certain I'm qualified for it. But the core premise is that instead of having it defined, the budget defined by the congregation structure, it's defined by ministry or program areas. So, for example, worship is a ministry or program area, and elements, everything that has something to do with worship, including part of the minister's salary, the percentage of the minister's salary and time that is spent on worship, is reflected in that section of the budget. Faith, lifespan faith development is another ministry mission area, and everything, including the religious educator's salary, and let's say maybe some additional amount of the minister's salary is for a religious education roles, are reflected in that section of the budget. So it's not based upon the congregation structure, but based upon the congregation's mission priorities. Now, I will tell you that in every congregation that I have seen that has a mission budget, they also have a structural budget somewhere in the background. That somewhere, maybe it's even on just the treasurer's computer or the bookkeeper, there is also a structural budget design somewhere in that system. And I bring this up because this can be confusing for congregations that have a mission budget. I have never seen a congregation successfully transition fully from a structural budget to a mission budget. They usually end up with both, and the structural budget becomes a background supporting document, and the mission budget becomes the public document in most cases. I'm not going to spend a lot more time on this. If you're interested in mission budgets, I highly recommend you have a conversation with two people, with your primary contact, but also with Pat Infante, Patricia Infante, who is our stewardship and finance program chair, program manager for the region. But really start with your primary contact. So also have the different congregations have different standards about the disclosure they do in congregational budgets. And the big place that this is usually seen is around staff salaries. There's a move in some of our congregations to only put a single number, a full total number for the staff salary, and to have the breakdown of what each staff member's salary and breakdown is in a separate document that is not disclosed. This is usually in our medium-sized to larger congregations. I'm not going to say that I endorse this approach. I personally think that it's important for the congregation to know what the compensation pattern is within the congregational staff. And I do know that some of our congregations have made the decision that it is an interest of the privacy of different members of the staff to not have that information be broadly disclosed. So in those situations, there is a sub-account, a sub-budget that details the different salaries and taxes and everything, for each employment taxes and everything for each of the different staff members. Are there any legal reasons for withholding staff salary details? The answer to that really is no, as far as I know in the states in which I work. This changes, and I'm not going to say that there isn't a state where there is not a legal reason for that. I've never, in the places where I've seen it done, it's never been for a legal reason that it's been done. It's almost always been done in an argument of the privacy of each staff member. Beth, do you have anything to share about that?
The only thing I would say is that the main time I've seen it done that way, it's been when there's been a major fight over salaries potentially, where people have argued, where they've tried to nitpick when they've tried to balance the budget and take a few, which instead of doing 10% across the board, they want to take more from one person than another. But it's also been argued that you don't know what the salary of every person sitting in the pew is. Why should you know what the salary of all your staff members are?
Right.
So those are some things that and it does capture the historicals going back. I mean, those records are in the bookkeeping system. This is just what's presented to the congregation in terms of that.
Yeah. So and in some cases where the board would actually have access to the full budget. It's what is published to the congregation. So there's also a pattern, and I didn't put this in here, but there's also a pattern of some congregations present a simplified budget to the whole congregation for approval and not the full budget. That the full budget is seen by the governing board, but a simplified version is what is shared with the congregation that basically just gives you the top line item. So this amount is going to religious education, this amount is going to building and grounds, this amount is, and without the breakdowns within the subcategories, the sublines of each budget line item. Okay, so next sheet is that also most congregations have some kind of off-budget funds, different fund sites that need to be accounted for outside of the yearly budget cycle. Now, in the most cases, these off-budget funds are things like endowment funds. Endowment fund is probably the most common version of off-budget fund. That is a fund that is kept within the congregation's purview. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes congregations have their off-budget fund in a separate nonprofit, a separate 501c3, but in most cases it's kept within the congregation's purview and under the governing board's fiduciary authority. There's also special or restricted funds. In other words, one of the most common version of this is if a special fundraiser was done to do something special and it either hasn't made enough money to do that thing that was special, or it made so much money there was leftover money and they didn't know what to do with it. The congregation can maintain a off-budget fund. That also, the other most common one is what's called ministerial discretionary funds. This is a fund that is usually kept with it by congregations, that the minister is able to do things like make grants out of it to give supportive gifts to people who are in need. That is a separate fund. It's not part of the congregational budget. Often they do special fundraising for this fund, and the minister has discretion over how this fund is used within a set of guidelines of being able to support people within and beyond the congregation. I will tell you that when I was serving the congregation in Ventura, California, we had a fund such as this specifically to help people who were experiencing homelessness. And we as the ministers had discretion over the gifts we made from that fund to support people who were experiencing homelessness through crisis and times of challenge and problems. So this is another type of off-budget fund that the board still has fiduciary oversight for. And this is one of the weird ones, is that because it has a pastoral nature to it, the board can't necessarily know what the gifts were for or who got them, because that then would violate pastoral confidentiality. So it usually takes some covenantal and systemic understandings between the board and the professional staff to be able to know what are the guidelines among which this fund is being used, and what does the board need to know to be able to feel it's exercising appropriate fiduciary authority. The last is the legacy gift funds, and this is where there is often a major gift given to the congregation for which there is either a specific reason for the gift or encumberment upon the gift, or if there is a legacy gift that there isn't an encumberment, but the congregation makes a decision that it's going to use this for a specific purpose that is outside of the congregation's budget. Now, all these funds have to be tracked in some way. Just because it's not in the budget does not mean it is not under the board's fiduciary authority. So a congregational board needs to be able to have not just awareness of the budget, but also awareness of the status of these kinds of special and restricted funds, and have some kind of reporting where they receive information about the activity and the status of these funds. And I do believe that every time a fund like this is created, there should be a policy that creates this fund and defines its use. One of the challenges we run into with these kind of funds and congregations is that the fund was created 25 years ago. No one remembers why it was created or what its purpose was or where it came from or what its restrictions are. Nobody can spend anything out of it because they don't know why it exists. And there's no guidance. So you have these pots of money that exist in congregations that are really almost inaccessible. They're not, because the board could make the decision to put a policy in place retroactively, but there is a fear that somebody will be upset about the use of that fund because they know, but they're not sharing. So my point is that if you're going to create a restricted fund, there needs to be a formal policy in place about the use of that fund, what its purpose is, and probably also captures a little bit of its history in order to be able to do good fiduciary authority and monitoring. The other thing I'll say is that for the most part, there are some exceptions to this rule, but for the most part, these kinds of special funds are often journal entries. And what I mean by that is that the actual monies are commingled. They're part of the congregation's main accounts, that they're not separate. They're not sitting in a separate bank somewhere. They're in the congregation's main accounts, but within your journal entries, you've recognized that this amount of money is part of a special fund and therefore not able to be spent in your operating funds. I will tell you that that commingling of funds, which, saves money in, not having multiple accounts, it is also one of the places where we most often begin to see congregations lose track of monies. That monies that, because it is commingled, journal entry funds often begin to be, sometimes, not often, but sometimes end up being used as if they were regular operational funds, and you lose track of them. That being said, I do get that the proliferation of accounts that could come from having multiple funds can also be problematic. So the right answer here is probably really good tracking of journal entry funds when they're not in a separate account. Go ahead. Beth.
One thing I'll suggest with that is that this is something the Ohio Meadville District did. We had an endowment. We had an investment account with the UUA, with the UCEF. That's where all of our restricted funds were put. We had a checking and savings account with our bank. That's where all of our operating funds were put. So while we had several restricted funds, they were all commingled with each other, but at least they were all off in one separate place where we could keep track of them. And therefore, it was pretty easy to keep track of when the money was going in and out, where it was going to.
Yep. And that was the recommendation I was going to make, was that combine your restricted funds into one account and put it somewhere else so that it's not commingled with your operating funds. And Beth named the UUCEF, which is the Common Endowment Fund. That's a great place to put it. Not just because we're the UUA and we're saying that, but it's just because it does have a decent rate of return on investment, and it also has a commitment to just investing. And it is fairly accessible. It's not as accessible as, say, a checking account would be, but it is the monies remain fairly accessible to you. But point being is that the most times we've seen problematic pieces is when these restricted funds are commingled as journal entries with the same funds as the operating funds. So I'm going to move from that. So the next section is to talk about, we've been talking about budgeting and we've been talking about special funds.
David, I'm going to interrupt you for a second because we have two questions in the chat.
Yes. Okay, sorry. Thank you.
One person asked, what about restrictions imposed by donors? You could capture that. That came up when you were talking about making a policy. You have to honor restrictions set by donors. You can refuse to accept the money if you feel the restrictions are inappropriate or something you could not live up to. And you can, if you're writing a policy, you should include that. You should include those restrictions in.
So I will say that in my last church, we had a policy that we did not accept restricted donations. And that meant we turned down money from time to time. And that was controversial. Whether it's a good or bad idea, I think there's a cost-benefit analysis to you. If you can live with the restriction and you document it well and put it in an actual policy, I think that's appropriate. If you can, and the other one is, could a board vote reflected in the minutes be sufficient for determining the use of restricted fund? My answer, I think, is no, because the board, frankly, boards don't do great about tracking their minutes, and it's not really all that accessible. It may be accessible 2 or 3 years down the road, but not 15. So a policy in your policy book, and if you haven't heard me in the last other sessions say have a policy book, but something that is more easily accessible than board minutes from 2 or 3 or 4 or 15 years ago. And also the motion tends to be fairly short. I think that the policy should be fairly robust. Should have in it all the restrictions, should have in it all of, a narrative about what was the circumstances upon which this was created. So we can give some more thought to this, and this is something to talk to your primary contact about, or to reach out to me or Beth to be able to coach you on if and when this is this is a situation you're actually working with. So thank you for capturing that, Beth. So balance sheets and profit and loss statements. Balance sheets and profit and loss statements in congregations basically are a tool by which you do actual comparison between the budget itself, what you planned, and what's actually occurring. Most of them sometimes include one previous year's budget, but not always. So they include the numbers from a previous year so that you have some comparison numbers. They sometimes also include a previous year's actuals, actual numbers, so that you have, if it's a June profit and loss statement, you might see the 2016 budget, the 2017 budget, the 2016 actuals and the 2017 actuals, and a percentage comparison. Both a percentage comparison between the 2 years and a percentage number of where you are in that total budget number for this year. Those are the common lines in a profit and loss statement or in a balance sheet of some kind. Now, not all of them have all those things. Some of them will only have this year's data. I don't think those are the best tools for you doing your fiduciary responsibility. But you have to go look at what is available in that profit and loss statement that you have. The most often, though not always, they use the same line item structure that the budget does. And I highly recommend that for simplicity purposes. I have seen cases where that's not true, where the profit and loss statement uses a simplified version, or where it uses a different structure, which I've never quite been able to wrap my own brain around, but I've found it in more congregations than I would have expected. The real purpose of this is for you to be able to make a judgment compared to previous years and compared to your planning, where the congregation is in its fiscal health. And if the profit and loss statement is helping you to do that, then it's serving its purpose. The next slide, if we could. So the whole point of this really is to give you enough information to say, go find your treasurer or your finance committee chair and spend an hour asking them to explain, to walk you through the documents and answer questions. It is, I made it a practice in every ministry that I was in. What is the usual form of accounting? Accrual. That is a common form of accounting in our congregations. I'm not going to go deep into that at the moment, but it is probably the most common form of accounting. But here's the point: go find your treasurer. Go find somebody who knows this, and sit down with them and the documents until you fully understand. Because it's hard for you to live your fiduciary responsibility as a governing board without having this basis. And we're spending a lot of this workshop on this because it is so important.
And I want to point out that what reports you get is often dictated by the software you're using.
Correct. And so and we'll just leave it at that. But whatever software you're using, go find someone who understands it and help you to understand. And I will tell you that finance people love it when people ask and when people show real interest. And if they don't, that's something to talk to your primary contact about. If you have a finance team that doesn't want to help you understand, that's a sign of a deeper problem. Shifting to the thing that was added is the question about contracting and negotiation. We're going to do this fairly quickly, and I just want to say that as you have contracting issues, you can feel free to reach out to your regional staff, because all of us do contracting work with congregations on an almost constant basis in one form or another. The congregational boards might negotiate contracts with contract ministers, with professional staff, with contract employees. And there is a difference between having a contracted employee versus having an at-will employee, both legally and in functionality of understanding the nature of the role. They might negotiate contracts with consultants and program leaders. They also might negotiate contracts with vendors and service providers, with donors. Congregational boards are often negotiating contracts with renters or with landlords if they don't own their own building. And with called ministers in a letter of agreement or call, one of the parts of the process of searching for a new minister is that negotiation process around the minister's letter of agreement. With financial institutions, especially when you're doing things like purchasing a building or leasing property or things like that, and also if you have an endowment, there's often contracting requirements of the governing board. There's also the cases in which your governing board is negotiating with departing ministers and staff, either in the case of a negotiated resignation, which is frankly some of the hardest negotiations that congregational boards are required to do, where you're negotiating the process by which not just the financial aspects of the shift in relationship, but also the interpersonal aspects. They're negotiating, how is the minister going to leave that office? What happens when people are reaching out to the minister who has left post the end of their tenure? What communication happens after a ministry, especially when that ministry has ended in challenging times? So the contracting is not just always about finance. It's also about relationships. And that includes when congregations have occasionally, I've worked with them as they've needed to do contracting and negotiation with a other congregant, usually around behavioral issues. I will tell you that the example of this I use is a congregation that I serve where we had a member who was a diagnosed kleptomaniac, who was struggling with it and working with it, and we had to negotiate with this person and come up with an agreement, a contract between the congregation and them about how we would all hold that behavioral challenge together in the community. And that ended up being a very important and good and difficult conversation to have, and us to have a binding agreement. And other union congregations, such as in cluster or partnerships, who knows? I always dream about congregations doing stuff together. So one of the most common versions of this is when two congregations are going to share a staff member, where they're either sharing a religious educator or a minister, or in some cases a congregational administrator. How the two congregations negotiate between each other for how that process will work is often key and vital to whether that partnership can succeed. So all of this negotiation and contracting is something that you probably weren't all that aware of, maybe when you came onto a governing board. And I will tell you, it doesn't happen constantly. It's not all the time. Governing boards have 2 or 3 people who are really good at this and really are willing to take some lead in it and do a lot of the background work behind it and bring that to the congregational board. And the whole board maintains fiduciary responsibility over the negotiations and agreements. So the biggest one, though, is professional staff contracting, is congregational boards contracting with professional staff. We can go to the next slide, please. And the first thing I say is that you're not alone in this, and you don't have to start from scratch. The Unitarian Universal Association has an office. That's not us. That's not me and Beth and Megan and Renee and Andrea and Hope and Evan and Shannon and who did I leave out? Did I get everybody in that real fast run?
Renee.
Well, Christina and Renee and yeah, and Sue. We have an office that's at 24 Farnsworth and across the country. It says not the best templates. I get it. They're working on that actually, but it does provide some baseline templates for staff contracting that you can begin to work from. And your primary contact also, because some of the templates are a little old and not the best templates at times, we also have collected, each of your primary contacts has collected versions of it that congregations have adapted and have made a little better. So reach out to your primary contact. But we do have a staff group who is working to try and create baseline templates that can help you all in some of that contracting and negotiation. They also do a set of salary recommendations, sometimes called the salary guidelines or the compensation guidelines. And those salary recommendations are based on real deep analysis of your geographical area and also the congregational positions. Now, they do their best with the congregational positions because every congregation designs positions differently. And, but, you know, they form a good baseline for you to have an idea what is a just compensation at different levels of experience and for your geographical area. They're not hard to interpret. Once again, this is a thing to reach out to your primary contact if you have struggle with. And Beth, can we send out a link to the compensation guidelines when we send this out? Thank you.
Yes.
Just so that you all can take a look at it. But it is based in understanding of the economic factors in the area of your congregation, and that office, the Office of Church Staff Finance, has actually done a study, compiled a study of each area where we have a congregation to be able to create those guidelines. We also have what we call compensation consultants, and compensation consultants are not UUA staff, but they are UUA adjunct consultants who are often experienced lay leaders like yourself, who have done some training with the UUA to be able to walk with congregations on questions of staff compensation and contracting. And they most often work in the search process for both religious educators and for ministers, but they are available to be able to walk with you all. And I think that's probably what I would say about that. So, so you have both your primary contacts, and you also have the compensation consultants that are available to help you all with contracting. Talked about the primary contacts. The congregation can choose to consult professional legal advice on staffing and contracting issues, and also human resources. And I never tell you not to do that. I will tell you, as one of my roles on your regional staff is I am the adjunct consultant program manager. In other words, I am the person who coordinates or trying to find the resources and experience consultants for congregations that our staff doesn't have. And I'm constantly looking for experienced HR professionals who are willing to make that experience available to congregations. So this is my little ad. I've got one or two at the moment. I would love to find some more experienced HR professionals that would like to be able to offer some coaching to congregations as not a lot of money, but as part of their love of this faith tradition. But we do have a couple already. So if there is a need and you're looking for that level of support, reach out to your primary contact. We may be able to connect you with an HR consultant. And I also just put in here to be aware of the use of exempt and non-exempt. If we're not going to go into the depths of it, but exempt employees under federal tax law are exempt from work hour restrictions. They're considered to be management positions. In most congregations, most religious professional positions are considered to be exempt positions, including religious educators and ministers, but many of the other positions may not be. And looking at whether the position really is a supervisory managerial position when determining whether they should be compensated by hourly, which includes overtime pay and other forms of compensation, or by salary, which wouldn't include those things. So next slide. So here's some real fast David's guidance for general contracting. And this is, I'm calling this David's guidance because I haven't vetted this with the Office of Church Staff Finance. This is just the principles that I work from with congregational boards in thinking about contracting. So first one is, if major financial commitments are involved, err on the side of getting official legal or financial officer opinion. And the UUA does not provide that service. Just to be clear, oftentimes we'd like to have the UUA lawyer look at this. I'm sorry, but the UUA does not have a lawyer on staff who does that. Most congregations are able to access that in their local community, and a national level opinion would not be able to reflect state law. And state law is really where where the rubber hits the road for most congregations in staffing decisions and also major financial contracting decisions. So the second one is to use outside consultants as necessary, in addition to connecting with UUA staff, either the Office of Church Staff Finance or your primary contact. There may be other consultants. I know that one congregation has used a consulting service to be able to hire people who are, it's a consulting, I don't think it's Angie's List, but it's something like Angie's List, that they use to be able to hire people to do work on their building. And it has some bonding to it and some recommendations and good, and I'm just saying, use that. Find those resources and use those to be able to get good referrals. And that leads into using reputable and, if possible, bonded vendors. Now, one of the challenges in congregational life that we have in contracting is we have a need for something in the congregation, and Mary has a nephew who does that. And Mary's nephew maybe has some references, maybe not, but it's Mary, and we love Mary, and we wouldn't want to tell her no about her nephew who probably needs the money, but he's not bonded. And there's, so you have to do your best to make a standard, and some congregations even place a policy that they use licensed and bonded contractors. Now, that usually costs a little more money than Mary's nephew, but in my opinion, the having someone who has the reputation and also has the backing is much better able to meet the need of the congregation. The avoid vendor contracts that have close connections to the congregation as possible. This can even be when you have someone who is a licensed and bonded contractor, but is a member of the congregation, is probably not the best choice to be able to do work for the congregation. Mainly because sometimes things go wrong in contracting, and sometimes that a project takes too long or goes over budget. And if it is a member of the congregation, you then add in that level of complexity of relationships to what otherwise is a straight business decision. Avoid contracts that require it be with an individual rather than the congregation. I bring this one up in particular because some contractors have a practice that they do not want to make contracts with institutions. They only want to make contracts with individuals who, frankly, can be sued more easily than an institution can be. I just put a standard that if you're doing work for the congregation, your contract is with the congregation. It's not with the congregational president as an individual, or with the building and grounds manager as an individual. To me, that's just a red flag in doing contracting work with vendors. Consider the justice implications of a contracting decision, but it's not the only factor. I go to a congregational decision that we turned into a significant conflict related to a flooring decision, where the decision came down to, do we go with the flooring that we can afford, or do we go with the ecologically sourced bamboo material flooring, which is going to cost 3 times what we had originally budgeted? And that is a discernment point to weigh. My point is that it is a discernment point, but it's not the only one. And the congregations have to be able to balance fiduciary responsibility with the justice implications. Otherwise, I'm just going to leave it at that. It's your job as the governing board to be able to do that discernment and balancing. The larger the contract, the larger the process for congregational disclosure. a $5,000 a year contract to provide lawn services probably does not need a congregational meeting. That's probably within the board's authority. A $100,000 contract to put a new roof on the building probably needs some level of congregational disclosure, if not congregational discernment, right? The purpose of that is really just you weighing the balance of perception being 9/10 of ministry. So err on the side of the larger the contract, the greater the disclosure that is needed. And all contracts should be reviewed by a contract review team of 3 to 5 people before signature and may consist of board members and others. It can be a subcommittee of the governing board. I say this because we have a pattern in congregations of wanting contracting to be done by one person. The building and grounds chair is going to meet with the contractor, is going to, and we're going to discernment. Define discernment, please. Discernment is the word. It's really thinking through all the implications of something. Thank you for calling me on my $70,000 seminary word. It's really doing a good process of looking at all the implications of a decision leading into that decision. And the point I'm making here is that one person who is closely tied to whatever the congregational need is may not be able to see all the implications. You want to put together a team of 3 to 5 people from different aspects of congregational life to look at that contract together and see different aspects of the implications of that contract. Thank you. So I hope that's good. I'm happy to have a conversation outside of this meeting around contracting. I know that really the best support we can do for you is in specific issues, is when you're working with a specific nature of a contract or something, to be able to reach out to your primary contact and have a 20, 25-minute discernment conversation about the implications of that. And over time, you get good at doing that yourself. So I want to shift us to some more tool-based stuff for the rest of our time. And I'm going to be flowing pretty fast, but all of this is designed that you will have access to it. The first tool to give you all is called process observation. Now, process observation is a somewhat fancy way just to say that every board should be learning and growing together, and not just in knowledge, but in how you function with one another. Process observation is about looking at how you function together. Not necessarily the content, but what are the relationships? What are the interactions? What is the flow of power? Are some people speaking more than others? What are some of the assumptions that may underlie board conversations and discussions that are often unsaid? So there are 2 main types of process observation: question-focused process observation and board dynamics process observation. So it is usually true, and if Carolee could mute, please. It is usually true that, thank you, that the person who is responsible for process observation in a meeting is often assigned at the beginning of the meeting, or assigned in the meeting prior, so that you're an additional duty, as you might call it, for you to have in a board meeting. And it's also best that it shifts to different people during different meetings, that it's not the same person doing process observation every time, leading the group in that process. It's often a responsibility that mostly flows through the trustees at large, but not always. I do recommend that whoever is running the meeting not do the process observation. So it may be appropriate to let the vice president run a meeting so that the president can do process observation every once in a while, if your president normally runs your meeting. So the 2 types. First is question-focused process observation. This is where a series of questions is chosen by the board and used by the board to observe board process. Next slide, please. The questions are often focused on areas where the board perceives a need to be more attentive, either to relationships or to important issues. So it comes out of your own discernment, may develop new questions for you to use for question-focused process observation. Questions can be used to make sure the board is functioning in the fullness of their responsibilities, and can be used to ensure the board includes particular issues and viewpoints in their deliberations. So in other words, it's a time, usually near the end of the meeting, where you use a series of questions to reflect on how you've been together. So I want to put up the UUA Board of Trustees process observation questions. Now remember, the UUA Board of Trustees is a board for a large nonprofit. They're not a congregational board, but this is the questions that they use in every board meeting to be able to reflect on how they've been together. And I'm just going to read them. The first is that evaluate the energy and focus of the board members. Did the board stay on task? Were board members sufficiently informed to be able to participate? Did board members participate appropriately? I'll tell you, that question right there probably highlights some of the challenges that the Board of Trustees had prior to them implementing these process observation questions, right? Number two, how did the agenda and discussion demonstrate the board's commitment to anti-racism, anti-oppression, and multiculturalism? Did board members share responsibility for raising AR, AO, MC concerns? And that's a key, that's one of those times where there is a value that they are wanting to hold themselves accountable to. And so they use a process observation question where at every meeting they're going to reflect afterwards, how well did we do that? How well did we live that value? How did the board demonstrate accountability to marginalized groups? Were marginalized communities invited to be part of the discussion? Once again, not just a value, but also a practice. Looking closely at who are we reaching out to for additional information? What are the sources we are using in doing this board work? And are those sources defined by some cultural assumptions that maybe we're not being fully accountable to? How did the board demonstrate our principles of governance style? Policy 3.1, our vision, don't worry about that. But really a question, how did we practice what we say we practice? How did we live to the commitments we make about our functioning? I will tell you that this is in here in part because the board has a habit of transitioning, if they're not paying attention to it, back to former styles of process, former styles of how they used to function as a governing board pre-making the commitments of the governing system they're currently using, which is policy governance. How did the board demonstrate our linkage to our sources? In other words, how did we connect back to our congregations, to our ministers, to our members, to our two major donors? How did we demonstrate our connection? So the board, and they may have adapted this since last I looked at it, but this is the questions that they end every board meeting with, to be able to reflect on how they've been together. Now, your questions would be different, and they don't have to stay the same over time. You can develop a series of 3 or 4 questions that really ask you, what are the things we as a board need to reflect on at the end of each meeting to make sure we are, one, changing our functioning, and being as inclusive as we can be within board process. And what those questions are really does depend on where you are as a board and what your culture is. I know that in my last governing board, some of the questions we asked, one of the questions we asked was, whose voices were heard the most? Whose voices were heard the least? Another question we asked was, which decisions directly reflected our commitment to our mission? How did decisions directly reflect our commitment to our mission? Because those were things that we were struggling with, making sure that all voices were heard and that there was space for everybody in the meeting. And 2, maintaining a commitment away from operational decisions towards our focus on our congregational mission, right? So go to the next slide. There's another style of process observation, and this one is one where it's less about reflecting based upon questions and more about inviting someone to reflect upon the emotional feeling, the valence, the experience of that board meeting. So in a process, a board dynamics process observation, what happens is someone is assigned to be the process observer for that meeting, and they take on a role of watching as if they are watching the board from the balcony. Remember the metaphor we used in the last session about being on the balcony? Watching the board from the balcony. And they may take notes through the meeting to be able to reflect back, you know? And some of the things they might reflect back is, you know, there was a moment of tension between Reverend David and Bob, and we didn't really hold to that, right? But we just want to acknowledge that that moment of tension happened. It wasn't anger, there was just some frustration that was there. And, you know, we didn't recognize the place where Carol shared something very deep, and it it didn't come back. And I just wanted to recognize that there was something that was left that was unprocessed. So and we want to name that everybody laughed together when Brian told that story about what happened on Sunday. You know, it's reflecting on, in board dynamics process observation, what you're attempting to do is reflect upon the relational nature of the board and highlight those relational natures. When I'm teaching a full class in this, it usually takes about 30, 35, 40 minutes, and we practice this. We do some process dynamics as part of the workshop. We're not going to do that tonight. I just want to introduce the two ideas to you. And there are plenty of resources and trainings out there that can help you to grasp different forms of process observation. For most boards moving into this as a new thing, question-focused process observation is the easiest. Board dynamics process observation takes some time and some discernment. And it really is, this one is really, really good to have different people do it at different times. And a board who has done this for a couple of years gets really good at it. But it often feels really weird at the beginning to have someone reflecting on the emotional nature of the relationships that have happened in that meeting that have just happened. Let's go to the next slide. This is something we've added, we pulled out of the last meeting and put into this one. So I'm just going to run through it real fast. And that is that there are two types of decision processes that are often used in our congregation. Remember, this webinar is really kind of a grab bag. So we're going to flip back and forth between different ideas. So different types of voting process that is often used in our congregations. And I define them as on a spectrum between voting process and consensus process. So voting process is the one that's in Robert's Rules of Order, and my copy of Robert's Rules is sitting back there on that shelf behind me. And it is the one that most of us are familiar with. It's motion, discussion, amending, voting, and decision, right? It's the basic flow. And the flow goes back and forth. There may be lots of amending. The whole process of friendly amendments versus non-friendly amendments and everything. But it's really that, motion, discussion, amending, voting, decision. And sets the ideal of making a decision on an issue. That its ideal is the decision. Its purpose is to reach the decision. It has some specific cultural attachments. I'm currently working on a training that I don't know when it'll be ready that looks at some of the cultural attachments that we have to governing processes in Unitarian Universalism. And I will say some of those cultural attachments are really connected to people of dominant culture, people who come into a situation feeling a similar level of power to one another, is one of the underlying assumptions behind most voting process, as if power is equal by everybody that is in the room. And it's most useful in very large group settings. Because of its formal nature and structure, it really is the best tool for making decisions when your ideal is the decision, for making decisions in larger groups. But it does privilege majority opinions. So it means that when you have a group within the subgroup within the group that is the majority, even at 50.1%, the process privileges that viewpoint. So that's the one we're most common with. I'm going to talk a little about consensus process, which is another model. And I kind of view these in most of our congregations as a spectrum, not as a polarity. But in this consensus process, the flow is a little different. It is question, discussion, blocking, adaptation, and decision. So because this one's new to us, I'm going to walk us through each one. The question is, what is the question that we're engaging? Whatever it is. Should we paint the sanctuary pink? Discussion. Open discussion among people with a recognition in the group that you're creating a level power arrangement where it does not actually exist. You're attempting to create a space in which power is leveled in that discussion, recognizing the reality that people have many different levels of power in any group that we come into. And in congregations, it can relate to tenure, it can relate to connections, it can relate to, frankly, how big of a donor you are. That but you're attempting to create a setting in which power is as evenly distributed as possible in that discussion. And one of the ways you create that level power relation, you try to create that level power relationship, is by giving anyone in the discussion the ability to block, the ability to prevent a decision from being made when they cannot live with the decision. Now, one of the things about consensus process is that when it's abused, it is abused in such a way that one person is not getting what they want and so uses blocking. The standard is actually a little different. The standard is not whether or not it's what I want. The standard is whether or not I can live with it, whether or not I can accept this and remain part of the community. Really, the standard for blocking a discussion, blocking a decision in a consensus process, is whether or not, if you take that decision, it would exclude me from the community. That you block when it would exclude you from the community. So in that level, it's not about just what I want. In a consensus process, nobody usually gets what they want. But it's about whether or not you can live with this decision and remain in the community. And when there's a block, when somebody is unable to live with a decision, the community seeks to adapt the decision until they can. So it's that continual process of coming back into adaptation. So if somebody says, I can't live with this, you stay in discussion doing adaptation until they can. And eventually, in a consensus process, if it's practiced well, you're able to reach a decision which allows everyone to remain in the community. You stay in discussion and adaptation until that decision. The ideal, rather than the ideal being the decision in voting process, in consensus process, the ideal is maintaining the community. That maintaining the community is a higher priority than the decision. It does tend to not lead towards quick decisions all the time, and it becomes more complicated. It seeks more collaborative decisions, and it also becomes more complicated the larger the group. There's a wonderful book out by Michael White, Dr. Michael White, who was one of the co-founders of the Occupy movement, who talks about the challenges of consensus process in large social justice groups. That it's an interesting thing, but consensus process tends to work better in smaller settings that are more focused on community, and it protects minority opinions. It protects the minority, and it attempts to balance power rather than assume a power balance. Does that make sense?
However,
yeah,
our youth programs use consensus almost exclusively. And what they've now come to realize is that it opens up the opportunity for the abuse of peer pressure.
It does.
And so that's one of the things they're now grappling with.
I'm not saying that either of these is not without complications. And that's why, next slide. Most of our congregations function somewhere in between these two systems. The most common practice that I have seen for boards is that boards stay in discussion until a decision has to be reached. And then if they haven't reached consensus, then they take a vote. That is the most common practice that we have amongst our congregations. Congregations tend to go more fully to one or the other during stress. So it's easier to be in between these two systems when you're not in high stress situations. And in high stress situations, congregations tend to go one way or the other, which can become a source of hurt expectations and feelings. If you really think that this is a consensus model and all of a sudden they're taking votes because the system is under stress, that can add to the feelings of, frankly, betrayal that can happen during some of those circumstances. So it takes an awareness of who you are. The most common practice in our congregations is a commitment to consensus until it is determined that consensus cannot be reached, and then making the intentional decision to move towards voting. Right? So to start with consensus, when it's clear consensus can't be reached and a decision has to be made, you then make a decision. Does the decision have to be made? If it doesn't, then you might stay in consensus for a while. But if it has to be made, then you move into voting if you can't reach consensus. That's the most common practice. I'm going to move us forward with this, but each process really shifts power between minority and majority opinion. And this is once again a place to have some conversation with your primary contact. And it is really a thing of, the key is being clear about what you do and what the expectations are, and having all board members understand what your process is going to be for making decisions. The challenge comes up when you have one set of assumptions about how you make the decisions, and then in a stressful situation, you do something else, right? And that is where we most often see the metastasization of conflict. So moving on to another good idea. If there is the most powerful idea that I think I have to share with congregational boards, my favorite, it is consent agendas. I am a big fan of consent agendas. Consent agendas take discipline, but they are so powerful. They buy the board time that can be used for everything else. The power of the tool of a consent agenda is the realization that not everything the board needs to be engaged live in the board meeting. That a lot of what the board members need to do, is to review material. And the old style was, all the committee chairs would come to the board meeting and present oral reports, and ministers would sit there and present oral reports. And frankly, I have presented amazing oral reports to boards over the years as a minister, and I was really attached to my oral reports, and it really took a lot for me to accept that it was a terrible use of time and board energy. That really what I needed to do was to present that material beforehand where people could engage it. So a consent agenda is where you make a determination that as much as could possibly be presented to the board before the meeting is presented to the board before the meeting, in written format, in slides and documents, however you do it, but that the board engages that prior to the meeting. And those items are on the consent agenda. And the first major item of decision for the board is whether or not they accept the consent agenda. Whether or not the items that were reviewed before they don't need discussion, they just need acceptance. Now, in a pure version of consent agenda, you can even put motions in the consent agenda. And if they don't need discussion, when you accept the consent agenda, all of those motions are approved. And board members may engage prior to the board meeting about those things. I say one of the big ones is, if you just had a long debate and you've reached an agenda item, but there's like one outstanding thing, and so you can't pass it in that meeting because you're waiting on one piece of information, that piece of information comes in, it doesn't change it, you can just put that motion on the consent agenda for the next meeting and it gets approved with everything else. But some of the common items, committee reports, financial reports, board reports, ministers' reports, all of the kinds of informational pieces minutes can go in the consent agenda. And if no one has any questions or concerns or objections, they can all be approved in a single vote at the beginning of the meeting. Now, if someone does have a question or an objection with a consent agenda, they can ask to remove an item from the consent agenda and have it added to the actual discussion section of the meeting. Now, I had an adaptation in the congregations that I've served where we would have an addition if you just had an information question. If there was something that was unclear, you did not have to remove the item from the consent agenda. You could just ask for that clarity in the discussion about the consent agenda. It's getting a little detailed, don't have to worry about it. The basic premise here is the realization that not everything has to be discussed in the meeting. And amazingly, that can buy you a lot of time in board meetings. I was amazed by how much of board meetings went away and how much time was given for other things when we stopped doing our reports orally in the meeting. The challenge here, though, is two things. The discipline piece is you have to set a time that this material comes out prior to the meeting with enough time for people to review it. And you have to get used to the idea that reports need to be in a week before the board meeting. And just build that into your system. You also need to have the discipline that board members will review the material before they come to the meeting. So use of a consent agenda requires that discipline, but I'm going to tell you it is the most powerful thing that I think congregational boards can do to change their own functioning. So next slide. So switching to Beth, you want to add something about consent agenda?
No, actually, I was going to say, can I take this one?
Take this one. Take this one.
Go
ahead.
So this is about board workshops versus board meetings. The Ohio Meadville District Board works with a consent agenda and board workshop style for the last 2 years they were in existence. Not all board business has to happen within Robert's Rules of Order, so I'm really familiar with this. Governing boards can meet by workshop to discuss, followed by a meeting to take official votes. So I'm going to give you an example. When you have when all the discussion takes place in the official meeting, comments about the discussion have to go into the minutes. So that means whoever's taking the minutes can't really focus on the discussion and participate. When you do a workshop, individuals may take their own notes, but there's no minutes being taken. So it allows for creative conversation. You can kind of do some consensus building. You can let people present information in a more discussion style, Q&A, and it allows some new ideas to percolate and to really just kind of set aside, all right, we're not in a business meeting, we're just going to talk about this. And then as you make decisions through the board workshop, you add items to your business agenda for motion. So your motion may have already been put on the business meeting agenda for after the workshop, but you changed your mind on what direction things should go, so the motion wording changes. You may have decided we're not ready to vote on this, so we're going to take it off the agenda. Or you may decide, hey, we are ready to vote on this and we didn't think we would be, and you add it. So it helps actually to increase creativity. It helps increase full participation, and it then allows the board meeting to be held efficiently, because when the workshop's done, you close the workshop, you call the meeting to order, the minutes are being taken by the secretary, you run through all of your votes, and you're done. So Ohio Meadville District did this for 2 years. I love this style. Our secretary actually requested it because she wanted to participate and couldn't focus on taking minutes at the same time. The way the board decided it was ready to move on is they did a thumbs up, thumbs down on everything before they moved on, whether or not it was ready to go. So that way they knew they weren't just somebody wasn't pushing it onto the agenda. We were moving on before the rest of the group was ready. So it's very helpful.
Yeah. So I will tell you, I've used this model for board retreats to come in and teach in a board retreat setting what it's like to do a board workshop. And then tell them, you're doing work, you're preparing. And then what we do at the end of the board retreat is they call a business meeting. The meeting comes to order. We've worked out all of the different elements. They go through Robert's Rules of Order, the votes, any additional discussion that needs to happen, they do that. I have seen us do, and Joseph Priestley District also used this model for many years, where you do a day and a half in a board retreat and then 15 minutes in the business session. And the amount of work that actually gets accomplished that way in that 15-minute business section has been filtered into by all of the deeper work that has happened in that board workshop. You can also do this in a regular board meeting, where you can spend maybe the first hour, if you have a 2-hour board meeting, the first hour in workshop, discussing in a more fluid way what is going to be on the agenda, and then move into the last hour or less being your actual business meeting. So just as an idea, let this rest and see and play with it and see, but not everything has to be done within Robert's Rules, and sometimes Robert's Rules is binding upon creativity and also has some deep cultural assumptions attached to it. So next slide. We're flowing really fast. This is another big idea. It's called open questions and powerful questions. So you just bought a whole bunch of time with having a consent agenda. Bought you maybe 30 minutes of your board meeting that you don't know what to do with. Here's what you can do with it. Open questions or powerful questions is a meeting technology where what you do is you take 20 or 30 minutes of your board meeting and you focus it on a discussion based upon a big open-ended question that usually relates in some way to congregational identity, culture, mission, and vision, from which no decision is going to be made. The purpose of an open question or powerful question conversation is about you as a board growing together in your understanding of each other and understanding of the congregation's mission and vision, doing deep, here's the seminary word again, deep discernment together, deep exploration together, without having a decision that's going to come from it. That it may inform decisions and actions in later board meetings, but in this board meeting, you're basically just exploring together. The boards I've worked with have told me that doing this work kind of turns boards. This feels like a covenant group section of a board's work, and kind of shifts the perspective. It helps to shift the perspective of the board away from being just an operational decision-making body and towards being religious leaders, towards being the religious leaders of Unitarian Universalism in your community. So the questions are usually, they're published prior to the meeting, and so board members can reflect on it before they arrive. No decision will be made, and it's intended to allow them to shift assumptions, and uses methods that allow all board members to share their thoughts and ideas, changes to a more conversational style, and maybe uses some process observation over time to make sure that everybody is being able to participate. So some example questions that I picked. Imagine a 20 to 30 minute conversation in your board meeting with no decision being made around the question of, what does the community around us need from our congregation? And having that as a powerful question. Another one might be, what might our staffing needs look like in 5 years? You're not going to make any decision about that, but you're dreaming, you're visioning together through that powerful question. How might stewardship need to transform as generations change? Well, that's going to bring in a lot of perceptions about how generations are changing, and what there. And I also find that boards who do this work, who do this practice, are able to identify in their normal board work what good future powerful questions could be, and capture that in their minutes. You know, if you are dealing with a question about somebody's behavior in the congregation that has come to the board, and the question you might have, it might generate a powerful question that is, what do we expect of each other and how we treat each other in this community? Might be a powerful question that is generated by that, dealing with that specific issue of an individual's behavior. And let's say it's someone has just taken the congregational membership list and used it for their Amway business, which literally happened to me, right? And a congregation I serve, right? So a powerful question about the question, can we push ahead? Yes, we can. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to move on from powerful questions to cottage meetings and town halls. So these are two different styles of ways that you can gather data from congregations. The first is cottage meetings are designed to create an intimate conversational setting for conversation among congregants. They're used when the board wants to gather information on specific topics from the congregation, and creates groups of congregations that do not often get together, and often uses powerful questions as a framework. So the idea being is that you invite a group in the congregation that isn't just the choir, that is members of the choir, but also members from RE, people who aren't usually together in communities within the congregation, to come together in a more relaxed setting, kind of like in a living room. I often say with some dessert, we'll talk about that, and do this powerful questions conversation together around issues where the board is trying to learn something. The board is trying to learn from the congregation. Cottage meetings actually can be used in lots of ways. It's used often for ministerial startups. It's used often in stewardship work and deep development work. It's often used in mission vision work and strategic planning, but the methodology is designed to get people out of their normal groups in the congregation into a relaxed setting of no less than 7, but no more than 12 usually, people, to be able to have a living room style conversation about some kind of powerful question. And the board is doing that in order to gather, to learn, to get, not really gather data, but really just to learn from the congregation. The other end is really what most of you all are probably familiar with, is congregational town halls. It's designed to put forth information and receive a direct response. They're usually conducted for the whole congregation, no matter who attends, which can often not be a lot of people attending town halls in my experience, unless there's a lot of anxiety about something. And this is not focused on relationship and not focused on learning as much as it is focused on communication, as focused on information exchange. It's focused on the communication between the governing board and the congregation. And it's often used as a presentation format that's a presentation followed by a question and answer session. Now, most of you all have probably experienced both of these in different levels, but I'm naming them as the two main styles of formal linkage, formal congregational interaction that boards use with congregations. There's also surveys. I think surveys are really bad. You know, we don't often engage well in surveys, or we often don't show our best selves in surveys. You know, these are the two that I think are best, but they serve a different purpose. One is for really the board doing deep learning about the congregation. The other is about information exchange, clarity and information exchange. Next slide. So cottage meetings take the most preparation and requires sign up or invitation. Usually involves some light refreshment or dessert, requires a facilitator, a note taker, and a host for each meeting. Usually between 7 to 10 congregants, and care is taken to break up normal congregational groupings, which we talked about. And if you're thinking about doing cottage meetings, I have a wonderful PowerPoint presentation that I'll be happy to send you. Just send me an email and I can send that out to you. It's pretty self-explanatory. I think it's wonderful. So town halls, the preparation is primarily in announcing the meeting and booking the space, and preparing the presentation, usually focused on a specific congregational issue, but can be more broad-ranging. I find they're more successful the more specific they are, and have a tendency to produce biased reporting. In other words, the people who are most likely to come to the town hall are the ones who are exercised about it, about whatever the issue is. The people who are less exercised don't come. So you tend to get a biased response of the people who care the most. And sometimes that can give an impression of a congregational majority when it doesn't actually exist. And attendance levels, like I said, depends upon anxiety. So pressing on, another idea for you to think about is called board culture assessment. And this is, for you as a board, there's lots of different processes, but they're really about looking at questions like, what role does mission play in decisions we make as a board? Are there commonalities amongst those we serve as a board? What are they and what they may, among those who serve on the board? What are they and what might they be? It's really looking at your own culture as a congregational board. And I'm just going to say that there's lots of different tools out there that you can use this. I have one that I love that we're going to send to you all. But next slide. Every congregational board has a culture. Each grouping of humans has a culture. We're human beings who create culture anytime we come together. And this culture often remains unseen by participants beyond our first time joining the group, because it's the water we swim in. It's the assumptions we've already made and we're comfortable in. And board culture may change over time, but it changes slowly, and it almost always lasts beyond any individual board tenure. I had a congregational board who told me that they were surprised that everybody was mad at them, because 2 years ago they weren't on the board and nobody was mad at them, and now they're on the board, everybody's mad at them. Well, because it's in the culture for people to be mad at the board, right? And you know, it's just a part of that congregational system. The only way to change a board culture is to explore it explicitly and make intentional change. So exploring it explicitly is one of the tools. Next slide. We'll send this to you. It's not a great thing here, but it's called a Congregational Leadership Team Assessment. It's based upon the work of, I'm forgetting his first name. I think it's Richard Lencioni, but Patrick Lencioni, sorry. It's based upon the work of Patrick Lencioni. And it's just if you've done a climate culture assessment at work in some corporate environment or academic environment, it does a similar thing. There's lots of other tools, but this is really about asking the questions about what are the assumptions we make as a congregational board. And I'm not going to go too deep into this, but just to name that there are lots of tools out there to help you do this, and your primary contact can also point you in good ways to do some assessment about your congregational board. Next slide. There's going to be some things we don't get to today. And once again, this is the first time we're doing this webinar, and an hour and a half is not enough time to put everything in here. I wanted to make a final comment on board roles and positions. And it talks about everything that we've said before, and that being that every congregation is different. We think that, you know, even our board positions that we have vary greatly depending on different congregations. You all are going to get these slides, and like I said, we designed them to be notes. But Sometimes in some of our boards, the officers are elected by the congregation. Sometimes officers are chosen amongst the board. Sometimes the boards have a systemic cycle, and sometimes each position is independently constituted. In other words, it doesn't flow from one to, you don't go from vice president to past president. You're just the vice president, with no expectation that you would be something else. Go to the next slide, please. So I'm just naming a few of the positions. You know, we have presidents, we have chairs, we have moderators, we have lots of other titles. Sometimes they are president of the congregation and sometimes they're not. We have treasurers. We also have financial officers. Sometimes they are members of the board and sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're just advisors to the board. We'll flow through these. We're not going to talk about a lot of this. Go to the next slide, please. For the interest of time, I'm going to move us. But just to say, read through these. I've done some descriptions of some of the different types of positions in our congregations. Next slide, please. And one more. Including some positions that congregations have that really don't exist in lots of other places, including recording secretary and assistant treasurer, and some congregations have their administrator as the ex officio member of their board. So just to understand that even in your congregation, there are many different configurations for who is a member of a governing board. Last slide. And I'm going to close with this, because this is one of the places where there is often some of the most confusion and conflict in congregations, and that is the difference between open session and executive session. In open sessions, the board is in a public meeting. Business may be conducted, motions and voting, and it's recorded in the minutes. All board members may attend, as well as congregations and the public, and the presiding officer may invite public participation and discussion. And this is for the majority of board business. There's a lot of confusion that happens about executive session, and I just wanted to take a second to say these are closed meetings only for board members and for specific invited individuals. Now, only for board members includes all ex officio board members, unless those ex officio board members recuse themselves. I'm going to make this very clear. If your minister is an ex officio board member, they're included in executive session unless they recuse themselves. Now, there are times you may want to ask them to recuse themselves, and they probably should. I will tell you that if you think it's appropriate for the minister or any other ex officio to recuse themselves, and they don't, that's an appropriate time to call your primary contact, because that is a sign that there is a deeper challenge happening in relationship. No business can be conducted in an executive session. Its point is not to conduct business. Its point is for the board to have confidential communications with one another to be able to determine where the whole board is. But you can't take motions in executive session. There are no secret motions in congregational boards. And any action that must be taken then in open session after the executive session. This is a place where there's a lot of confusion, and I just wanted to spend a moment on that.
And legally speaking, personnel issues and real estate transactions must be done in executive session.
Correct. They must be discussed in executive session.
Right. You can't discuss either of those in an open session meeting. You can only make a motion and vote. Yeah,
the motion and voting has to be in open session. So with that, I want to thank you for your time. I apologize that we had to rush through the stuff at the end. Marion Keys asks, back to consent agenda. If some trustees simply agree with the consent agenda, how do you know they have in fact read and considered the material? Also, what is the common board meeting length? Two questions there. The first one I will just answer quickly is to say, this is about your covenant and about your commitments to one another and about trust in your other board members. And consent agenda requires a level of trust that you may or may not have, and if you don't have that, then consent agenda may not be appropriate. What is the common board meeting length? Most boards shoot for between 90 minutes to 2 hours. I think it's common sometimes that they go over. So with that, I want to thank you all. Once again, the slides will be sent out, and it's been great to be with you all these 3 sessions, and I've learned a lot about how to do this. So if you come back, and when I'm probably redoing this in the spring, it'll probably be different. So know that you can come back and come to this as many times as you wish, and it's been great to be with you all. Thank you for attending all of these. Be well.